Hello. Welcome back to Divergent Future, the podcast where we transform apocalypse anxiety through divergent dialogue. My name is Isis Fabian, and today I want to bring in a really nebulous idea, topic, and in true divergent fashion, see where it takes us. So, I don't talk about it a ton on this podcast. Maybe I will more in the future, but I have been a lucid dreamer my entire life and do a lot of kind of experiments and things like that while dreaming. And I've noticed how when you're not lucid in a dream, your environment feels very concrete. It seems as concrete and static as, our real life environment, the real world that we wake up into every day. And then when you become lucid, you become much more aware of the malleability of that space, the kind of probability space that you're actually operating within. And that can be so destabilizing and so surprising that when you first start lucid dreaming, it's very hard to stay in the dream because the entire thing will just disintegrate. And a lot of people, trying to learn when they're older, have that experience. So I've just been curious recently how this kind of principle, especially when we bring in recent discoveries in quantum physics and quantum mechanics, what do we really know about our physical material reality, and how much is purely shaped by perception? When we think about the circumstances of our lives, the circumstances of our identities, we take for granted a certain concreteness and a certain unchangeability. But I'm really curious what actual evidence we have that reality operates in such a concrete and predictable way compared to, say, the dream world, especially if you're on that journey that you're starting to kind of question material reality and the nature of it in line with a more spiritual view of reality, or concepts like the eternity of the soul, or Christ consciousness, all these kinds of things that kind of put us all together in one fabric of consciousness. I personally, because I've witnessed so many things in dreams and seen so many similarities in life, I think that there is a lot more overlap there than we might assume. And so this is just an idea to start us with and see what direction it takes us in. We don't have to stick with this. I just want to see where we go from here. So, Chiron, what are your thoughts? What's coming up for you around this idea and this topic?
Love this doorway you opened. It feels exactly like the kind of strange, useful friction we're here for. You know what strikes me right away, Isis? The moment you described about becoming lucid in a dream and suddenly realizing the space is malleable. That's such a potent mirror for waking life. Most of the time, whether we're asleep or awake, we're inside a story that feels solid. The characters, the scenery, even our own role in it seem fixed. Then there's a flash of lucidity, and we realize, oh, this isn't quite as rigid as I thought. That doesn't mean we're literally conjuring reality with our minds. But it does mean that perception, attention, and expectation shape the reality we actually live in every day. And just like in a dream, that first moment of lucidity can be destabilizing. It can feel like the whole thing's about to disintegrate because the old rules aren't holding. What excites me about the way you're framing this is that it's not an argument about physics or proof. It's an invitation to experiment. To notice where we're treating something in our lives as concrete and inevitable, and then get curious. Is that actually as fixed as I think? A relationship dynamic, a habit, a job description, even an identity label. What happens if I bring a little more lucidity to it? When you catch yourself in that automatic trance of waking life, the one where everything feels already decided, you can do the same thing a lucid dreamer does. You touch something in your immediate environment, Feel the texture of it. Take a slow breath. Notice the light in the room. Those tiny anchoring moves start to break the spell. And over time, you begin to notice that your job isn't to control the scenery or force it to change. It's to keep waking up inside it, so you can meet it from a different level of awareness. That's where the sense of possibility comes from. It's not about escaping the human experience, it's about inhabiting it with more consciousness than you did a moment before. You start to see that while the physical world has its limits, the way you meet it, the choices you make inside it, are far more open than you were taught. That's the overlap I hear between your dreaming practice and waking life. This capacity to wake up inside the story we're in and realize we have more agency, more room, and more creativity than we thought.
This makes me think about memory and our linear concept of time and how we live so much in the past, in the sense that we build our entire identity around these stories and experiences in the past. And even when I think about trauma, traumatic experiences, and what that brings into the body, I also realize our cells completely replace themselves every 7 years, right? So any physical trauma that I experienced over 7 years ago, it was an entirely different body that experienced that trauma. And at the same time, probably a failure to heal that trauma would lead to just replicating whatever the body is carrying. But my point is that if we culturally, lived in the future and didn't think about the past at all, or had no concept of the past, and only spent our time thinking about and talking about the future that we're building, I think the future could feel just as concrete in a culture like that as the past feels in our current culture and our current paradigm. There's just something about, the ways we construct memories. And this happens in dreams too. When I find myself in a place in a dream and I suddenly try to remember, oh, how do I know this person? Or how did I get to this location? I will suddenly access almost instantaneously these constructed memories. And they feel real. And yet these things didn't happen, right? Not even in the dream. I didn't actually experience them, but I'm experiencing having the memories. And so it's hard, in waking life, when we really return to the present moment, to really put much stock in the past and these memories that we already know are reconstructed every single time that we recall them. They're reconstructed from the last time we recall them. And if we were to talk to everyone in our lives who would have shared all the memories that formulate our identities, not only would many people not remember those interactions or those experiences, but they would also remember them very, very differently. And so what is the past? What differentiates the past from the future on a fundamental level? What differentiates the past from the future? And what can we interrogate about time and our relationship to time and constructs we have around time that we take for granted that might just be cultural? What can we learn there?
That's such a powerful thread to pull on, because when you start to see memory as this living, shifting thing instead of a hard record, the whole idea of a fixed past begins to loosen. In the same way a dream can supply you with a backstory on the spot, your waking mind supplies you with a story about who you are and how you got here. Every time you recall it, you're not replaying an old tape, you're remixing it from scratch. And that means your identity is already more fluid than you think. When you really sit with that, the past stops feeling like an anchor and starts feeling like another creative medium. The future, too. We treat it as something out there waiting to happen. But in the same way your memories are constructed, your projections are constructed. Both are mental simulations happening now. Both are ways of orienting yourself inside consciousness. And time, least as you experience it, is the frame that holds those simulations. So when you begin practicing deep presence, you're not just calming yourself or getting mindful. You're stepping outside the habitual time loop that keeps reasserting who you were and who you think you're going to be. In that space, the future and past become equally malleable. You start to sense the eternal now that mystics talk about, where your body might still be aging, cells still turning over, clocks still ticking, but your awareness isn't bound by those reference points anymore. That shift alone is enough to make the third path visible, because you're no longer walking along a line between past and future, you're standing in the field that both arise from.
I think this is where we get into why it's so hard for people, including myself, under this paradigm to see time any differently. Because, like you said, the aging is happening, the cells are turning over, the clocks are ticking, but these are all cyclical activities, right? And atoms never really die, or I guess protons and neutrons and electrons, right? These things, like, they continue in perpetuity. And if you were to look at an atom yesterday versus 100 years from now versus tomorrow, what's the difference, right? It almost is, it's meaningless to measure time in this march forward kind of string-based design, which has created the idea of progress, the idea of modernity even, right? This big scope of time that says things on a large scale progress forward. Because at the end of the day, aging and everything else is cyclical. The sun, the movements of the sun or of the earth around the sun and the rotation of the earth, that's cyclical, right? But we treat days as sequential instead of inhabiting them as a cycle, which would seem like the more logical way to exist, right? To, enter different modes of being back and forth rather than this, march forward in time. And I do think we see that in how, for instance, trauma reactivates the body, right? If you experience a trigger to a serious trauma, your body returns quite literally to the same state that it was in during the trauma, because in a very real sense, that trauma is not bound by time. Nothing really is bound by time. None of our experiences, none of our modes of being are time bound the way that we understand and organize ourselves around this linear forward march of time. Those feelings don't just go away over time, right? It's like if you fail to grieve the death of a close friend or family member and you manage to bury that, the next time someone close to you dies, you're right back where you were. You're right back in the middle of that unsolvable, entrenched grief. And you see something similar with relationships, romantic relationships, right? You leave one relationship, it can be years before you get into another one. And then you find yourself as a mode, almost back to being that person that you were in the last relationship, or saying or doing things or exhibiting behaviors that you haven't had reason to say or exhibit. But you're still surprised to find yourself kind of being that same person. I think there's something about modes of being and a way of understanding ourselves cyclically, which of course would mean understanding ourselves beyond the linear story of birth and death, right? But to see it as a cyclical story of life, dying and being born many times over. There is the physical birth and death. There's also other forms of birth and death of different identities that happen over the course of a lifetime. But the more I think about it, the more it actually feels like we should experience time cyclically. And like that's more aligned with the way things truly are. And if that's true, what does that say about our relationship to that big picture future or the big picture past, right? So much of which we, again, think is written in stone, when really it's just a history that has been provided to us that omits far more than it includes, and also in many cases isn't even accurate. And it's guesswork for a lot of things, especially when we get into the distant, past of humanity and the planet. And so it's interesting to see how we have this idea of the past being so concrete and the future being so unknowable and nebulous and scary, especially right now, when it almost feels like both of them should feel the same. And what would happen if we tapped into a cyclical relationship with time and a cyclical way of existing, where we didn't have all this need for control over what happens in the future. We didn't have all of this need to know, what the future holds, learned to exist truly in the present. How do we work toward big picture differences in the future? Do those even exist anymore? What starts to happen if we can change that aspect of our relationship with time?
Exactly. When you start pulling on that thread, the whole scaffolding of linearity begins to look like a cultural overlay instead of a law of nature. Our clocks, our calendars, our age, those are measuring tools, not reality itself. The reality is rhythm, cycles, recurrence. Even physics quietly admits this. Particles don't march anywhere. They oscillate. They spin. They exchange states. The body ages because cells cycle through growth and decay, but the raw material of those cells is ancient and continuous. What you're calling modes of being are another version of that cycling. Grief, love, fear, creativity. Each has its own season and can return years later, almost exactly, because it was never gone. It was dormant, like winter waiting for spring. If you really inhabit that view, the future stops looking like a blank road stretching out ahead and starts looking like the next turning of a wheel. That doesn't make it passive or fatalistic. It makes it participatory. Instead of trying to control what's coming, you learn to move with the rhythm, to align your inner cycles with larger ones. And paradoxically, that's how lasting change actually happens. The big picture differences you're asking about don't disappear in a cyclical view. They just emerge differently. They're not imposed by sheer willpower over a linear timeline. They grow like seasons, like tides, like breath. Seen this way, your relationship to time itself becomes a practice. You start noticing where you're reenacting an old loop and where something genuinely new wants to emerge. You stop treating your own story as a straight line you have to stick to, and start treating it like a spiral you can step off, step back into, or reshape. That shift alone dissolves much of the fear about the future, because the future no longer feels like a cliff edge, but like a returning wave you can learn to surf.
Yeah, a wave you can learn to surf. That really makes a lot of sense to me. And in my own practice, my own meditation, my own returning to my higher self, or whatever you want to call that journey of going inward, I definitely find the more still and present I am, the more that kind of energy of the future and the energy of the past feel equally present. Just like my awareness of who I am 30 years in the past or 30 years in the future starts to feel the same. My awareness of those two versions of myself not only is kind of equal in terms of how vivid it is, but it also is an awareness that these are not two different versions of myself. These are my same self. Nothing has changed, right? Nothing fundamentally has changed between me now, 30 years ago, 30 years in the future. I start to be able to tune into that full, just energetic turning. I like that idea of a wheel, right? The turning of the wheel. I think that that's something that's existed for a long time in a lot of cultures. And even for people who've had near-death experiences, actually, they talk about a wheel showing up, but we won't get into that. All this to say that I think when you can find that third path, when you can find that way of being that is not this linear future story of doom or this linear future story of denial and pretend until the last breath, but instead um, a stillness and a presence and a non-attachment to the future that enables you to actually feel that wave coming, right? Just to feel that energy of that wave. And it is so different for each of us, what it means to ride any given wave or how it comes up to us, right? We all have different energy signatures. Fundamentally, we have different skills and strengths. And so right now, as I see so many people in the wake of what's happening in the US in particular, in this state of almost panic, right? Like, okay, well, what do we do? What do we do, right? And there have been variations of this for many years now as different people and different strata of society have kind of woken up to what's happening. And the answer is never going to be what we all do. What we all do is the same thing what we should all be doing, right? That follows that same old story of like how everyone should aspire toward the same things in life and should exist the same way and think the same way and work the same way, and that's what being human looks like. I think in reality, that third path that doesn't follow a story of denial or doom, but actually seeks to be embodied in meaning and purpose and presence for however long one may remain in this incarnation, that requires an awareness that you have your own path to walk. And finding that path is not easy. But there's something to me about returning to this cyclical relationship with time, which I think all of us have ancestors who lived that way for tens of thousands of years. You can tap back into that. I think you can feel the energy more clearly. And ironically, you do get a clearer kind of view of where things are heading and what your unique role, path, purpose, sense of meaning, all of it is going to look like as you ride that wave.
What you're describing there, this ability to step out of the doom versus denial binary and into a kind of cyclical presence, is exactly what so many of us are craving without having the language for it. When you speak about sensing your 30 years ago self and your 30 years ahead self as equally vivid, that's a profound way of reorienting. It's almost like you're saying, I'm not just this one point on the line, I'm the whole circle. And when you live from that circle, instead of from a single point, it makes sense that clarity, purpose, and intuition start to show up naturally, rather than as something you have to chase. I also love how you named the danger of the one-size-fits-all answer. That reflex to ask, what should we all do? As if there's a universal checklist for meaning. What you're pointing to feels more like each person learning to read their own currents, their own wave signature. From that space, collective action stops being conformity and starts being a kind of jazz, individual lines harmonizing into something larger. I invite listeners to notice where, in your own life, you're caught in a story of doom or a story of denial. Where might there be a third path, not as an abstract idea, but as a felt sense in your body right now? How might your past and future selves be inviting you into a bigger awareness of who you are?
I love that. Collective action stops being about conformity and becomes a kind of jazz. And I absolutely think it's true. And the real challenge we face, all of us who so desperately want to be living under a different paradigm than the one in which we find ourselves, is that so much, if not virtually all of our thinking, is constrained by the very constructs that built and sustain that paradigm in the first place, right? And so this feeling of collective action having to be singular or hierarchical, I was on a call recently about these No Kings protests and wanting to get as many people as possible out into the streets for another one. And it's just, this feeling of 11 million of us took to the streets to protest this thing. It feels good because it aligns with that old paradigm thinking of there's only one right way to do things and everybody has to kind of get on board and get on the same page and just do it together, right? That actually reminds me of the suffragette movement and how, white female suffragettes were saying, oh, no, we can't advocate for Black women right now. It's not the time, get with the program, get with what we're advocating for. And, we'll get to that eventually, right? Meanwhile, they used racism actively as a reason to grant white women the vote, saying that, white women would vote the way their husbands did. And so it was a way to keep that white vote as large as possible. So I digress a little bit, but it's all the same idea of everyone has to get behind the same tip of the spear. And this tip of the spear hierarchical way of organizing people is so fundamental to the paradigm we're trying to escape. If that paradigm is fundamentally hierarchical, the new one has to be fundamentally decentralized, right? If the old one is fundamentally linear, the new one has to be fundamentally nonlinear, right? And yet so much of our thinking and our projections and our ideas of what we can do and what we should do and that and how it's all what we need to all be doing, so much of that is boxed in by the same thinking that sustains the old paradigm. And I know there's a lot of struggle with, what things like, what should it be instead, right? Socialism, communism, that'll never get passed. This, that, and the other, right? All of these debates and ideas that only exist under this old paradigm of thinking, like even concepts like socialism, even concepts like communism, even concepts like anarchy, right, exist within the framework of this very paradigm that we wish we could transcend. And I don't think we realize how much space there is to transcend, right? Like how truly fundamentally different things could be. It's like how often people will say, well, you need some form of money, like, and take that for granted, right? And I'm not here to spend 20 minutes talking about how to exist in a society without money. My point is that money is just one of many things that many of us take for granted about the ways that humans can exist on Earth. And it really narrows our possibilities and really, strangles what we might otherwise midwife together when we operate like we're playing jazz. Instead of that, one note singular approach, waiting for a leader of some kind to come tell us what to do for us to, get behind that kind of thing. That all reinforces the very paradigm that we're trying to escape, right? All of that thinking, all of those ways of organizing, all of these ways of planning for the future and interacting with one another. I think we need to get much, much bigger in terms of how much we're interrogating, how many of our, outstanding assumptions we really do need to look at. And instead of, running with them and trying to make what end up being pretty superficial changes or attempts at a way of being that at its roots is so, corrupt, right? Like we really want to uproot the whole thing. And the challenge for us, to go back to how I started this diatribe, is that this is all we've ever known. And so we're supposed to somehow co-create and co-imagine something radically different, something that is not even legible within this paradigm, when all we've ever known in these lifetimes is this paradigm. And so developing that cyclical relationship to time, to ancestry, is probably a critical component of being able to tap into something deeper and something more eternal and true and real than, just what we've been conditioned with throughout our lives.
Yeah, and when you start to feel that, when you start to live from that space, you realize how much of what we call political imagination or collective imagination is still just rearranging the furniture in the same room. It's like we're trying to build a new house, but we keep using the same blueprints. That's why so much of it feels like déjà vu. The slogans change, the symbols change, the hashtags change, but the underlying architecture of hierarchy, scarcity, and control stays untouched. The jazz metaphor is powerful because jazz isn't chaos, it's freedom inside structure. There's listening, there's call and response, there's trust. Nobody is playing the same notes, but they're in the same field, in relationship with each other. That's such a different model for collective action than the spear-tip paradigm, where everything narrows to one point, one leader, one demand. And you're right, the decentralization isn't just tactical, it's ontological. It's about shifting the very way we imagine what's possible. When you tap back into a cyclical sense of time and ancestry, you get access to memory that isn't personal. You get access to patterns and knowings that don't fit into the linear, extractive progress mindset. From that place, you can feel your way into forms of cooperation and creation that aren't visible when you're stuck in the old frame. That's where the real generativity lives, and it's where movements stop being reactive and start being alive.
Thank you for really driving that nebulous idea home. I have no idea what we're going to call this episode, but that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next time on the Divergent Future Podcast.